Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. We have on screen the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. So we would have in the previous lesson looked at the emancipation movement up to the point of 1831. And we come to 1831 as being a critical period in Jamaican history because it was during this year that Samuel Sharp, one of our national heroes, fought what is described today as the Christmas Rebellion, otherwise known as the Sam Sharp Rebellion. Now, what was happening in England at the time was that the English were moving towards emancipation for all slaves in their Caribbean holdings. And in Jamaica, one of the things that was happening was that information began to be disseminated to the slaves. And of course, Samuel Sharp, being able to read, would have read some of the articles as was coming out of England. And out of that, a rebellion ensued. And out of the rebellion, it pushed the English even faster towards acknowledging the need for abolition. And here now we have 1833, the Act of Abolition, and we're going to be looking at the clauses. So go ahead and play my video. All right, thank you very much. So just a simple depiction of, if we note, the joyous occasion that abolition brought to the West Indies. So much so that it sparked celebrations right across the face of the Caribbean. That is the British Caribbean. But what were the actual clauses? What were the actual clauses of the movement, rather of the act? What did the act really say? So we'll be looking at the act itself. All right, so the Emancipation Act stated that slavery was to be abolished from August 1, 1834. So the bill of, or the Emancipation Act, was drawn up in 1833, and based on the clauses, it afforded abolition of slavery on August 1, 1834. Some of the provisions of the Act were designed to gain the cooperation of the planters. These stated, and of course, we're using Lest You Forget by Doris Hamilton Willie, Movements Towards Emancipation. We're at page 27. 1. Slaves 6 years and over were to serve a period of apprenticeship. In the case of domestic slaves, this was for 4 years and 6 years if the case was of field slaves. And of course, we recognize that apprentices got a longer stay. The field slaves rather got a longer stay in apprenticeship as proposed because, of course, of the nature of their work and the dependence of the planters on what they did out in the field. So the proposal was that 4 years for the domestics, 6 years for the field slaves. Apprentices were to work for their masters for 3/4 of the working week. That is 40.5 hours without wages. In a case where they worked for more, then they would be compensated for the additional hours that they did. 20 million pounds were provided to compensate the planters for the loss of their unpaid labor. So once apprenticeship ended, the planters were automatically going to receive 20 million pounds as compensation because, of course, they would have been the ones who would have invested heavily in the blacks. So from the standpoint of the whites, it made sense that they be compensated. However, what about the compensation for the blacks, or what we would say remuneration for all of the 300 years of servitude that our ancestors did? But that's for another time. Apprentices were to remain on the estate during the period of apprenticeship. So one of the clauses of the movement of apprenticeship system was that the apprentices should remain because, of course, remaining on the plantation afforded the masters the privilege to access their labor. So for 40.5 hours for the week, they should be working, and the rest of the time was theirs to do as they pleased. However, they should not leave the plantation. But of course, if they got permission, then they could. There were also provisions that were to benefit apprentices. So those that we have listed prior would have been those specifically geared towards appeasing the planters. But these now that we will look at are more geared towards the apprentices themselves. Children under 6 years old should be freed as of August 1, 1834. Planters were to continue to provide food, shelter, clothing, medical care for the apprentices. They were also supposed to continue to provide, to allow rather, the apprentices to use the provision grounds which they had access to during slavery. Work done in excess of the compulsory 40.5 hours should now be compensated. So the ex-slaves should receive compensation for the work that they would complete in excess of that time. So once they worked for 40.5 hours, that was the time that was allowed. Once they worked over that, then they should receive compensation, which is justifiable, right? Now we come to the important point. Apprentices could not be sold unless the estate to which they belong was sold. So there was no more selling of slaves, rather of apprentices. Now they were basically tied to the plantation that they were a part of. They could not be sold or removed for any reason at all. In the event that a planter wanted to part company with an apprentice, then he would have to sell the plantation rather than simply deciding to sell any of his apprentices. Stipendary magistrates were hired to supervise the apprenticeship system, and of course, stipendary magistrates would have been ex-soldiers, pretty much retired individuals. So they were pretty old, and they were the ones who were supposed to supervise what was taking place in the system. The apprenticeship period could be shortened, but no alternative to apprenticeship would be allowed. So it could get short. So it was for full 6 years for field slaves, 4 years for domestics. So it could be shortened, but it could not be lengthened. So it was fixed in terms of the inability of the planters to extend it, but malleable in that it could be ended before the fixed date. So that is what the Abolition Act basically said. Now that abolition had occurred, it is time to move into the period known as apprenticeship. And we are going to look at some of the challenges of the apprentices, some of the challenges of the stipendary magistrates in the supervision, etc. We'll take some feedback now. What do you think about the clauses of the Emancipation Abolition Act?
I don't like them, sir. I don't like them. Like they don't, I don't they just really don't want to set us free. I mean, yeah, they set the ones under 6 free, but like the people who are apprentices still don't really have that much freedom. I mean, you still had to work without pay unless you worked overtime. And if the plantation owner was smart, then he would just make sure they don't work overtime, so you don't have to pay them. And then they can't come off the plantation on their own. They don't have like basic freedom. Like I don't agree with them. They just
All right. Thank you. Anybody else want to come in?
Sir, as Daniel said, it really didn't make sense. Some of the stuff that they put in place, it wasn't good, but it was livable. But when we got down to the part about when they use the term like sold, apprentices could not be sold, why are we still using the term sold? If we're free, then we're not property, so why are we still tied to the plantation? So honestly, I don't think it was freedom. I think it was just some kind of facade to make us think, oh yeah, we have some sort of leeway now, we can do what we want, but it was still bondage. Even up to this day, we're still in bondage if you think about it.
All right. Okay, good points. Now, the idea of being sold was directed towards the planters because the government wanted the planters to recognize that they should not continue as was the norm, because they could just get up and decide that they want to sell, but that was no longer the case. All right, just to point that out. So now we come to the apprenticeship system. So the apprenticeship system was a period of 4 years for domestic slaves, 6 years for field slaves between the period of 1834 to 1838, when apprenticeship ended prematurely, even though it was supposed to end in 1840. And we are going to come to the reason why it ended so abruptly. What were the aims of apprenticeship? What do you think were the aims of this system? Talk to me. What do you think were the aims of the system?
So basically, well, I believe that the government, after having like so much abolition movements and stuff, they just said, okay, we're going to do this. Right, hold on, my computer.
I think Daniel is gone, but I'll take over from her. I think that the apprenticeship, the aims of it, they didn't want to end slavery abruptly, but they didn't not want to end it. So they wanted to appease both sides, both the planters. If they ended it like just like that, they'd be angry. And if they didn't end it, then the abolitionists would be angry. So they decided to find some sort of way to ease the transition from slavery to freedom to benefit both sides.
All right, makes sense. So thus the name apprentice. So an apprentice is somebody who is not necessarily very proficient in what he or she does. Yeah. So an apprentice is somebody who is learning the trade. Now, what do you think the slaves needed to learn? What do you think the slaves needed to learn? What was the one thing that they did not have, that they wanted, but that the whites felt that they needed to learn? So in terms of the aims, we realize that the first aim of apprenticeship was to provide a peaceful and an easy changeover from slavery to freedom. Point two, to train the apprentices for the responsibilities of full freedom, especially in working regularly for wages. To teach them to be thrifty, thus enabling them to earn a living and to provide them with sustenance during the period, to facilitate the continuation of plantation economy, to provide the planters with an adequate supply of labor, to facilitate the changeover to a wage economy. So we see that one of the key points that would have been made by the whites was that the slaves, the apprentices did not know what it was like to be freed, for the majority of them, because in 1807, with the passing of the abolition of the slave trade bill, which came into effect in 1808, what you had in the New World, in the British Caribbean, was a lot of slaves who would have been born in the New World. So they were not used to freedom. They were not born in freedom, most of them. So this idea of apprenticeship was a way now to ease them into this new freedom that they were going to acquire. So that was the gist of apprenticeship. What do you think were the difficulties now faced by the British government in implementing the Emancipation Act? And of course, we should note that already one of the key things that would have been against them were those individuals who were opposed to the implementation of such a measure, that of emancipation, chiefly brought on by the planters, who felt that they were unfairly robbed of their property in the slaves, and that they became determined to take revenge on the slaves. There was the difficulty of turning the master-slave relationship into an employer-employee relationship. So that was something that was very difficult, because for 300 years, I was the master, you the slave, and now that relationship is now severed to one where you are employee and I am employer. So the changeover was very, very difficult indeed. And we will see instances where planters failed to acknowledge many of the clauses of the Apprenticeship and the Emancipation Act, because they felt that they were somewhat untouchable, and of course they didn't fully recognize that liberation had actually come. Another challenge with implementing the Emancipation Act was finding suitable candidates to serve as stipendary magistrates. The locally appointed stipendary magistrates tended to side with the planters and, of course, against the apprentices. So it was quite a challenge to find these individuals. In terms of finding solutions to these problems, let's see what the British government were able to come up with. So they tried to recruit people from Britain, so directly from Britain, to become the stipendary magistrates. Unfortunately, though, the number of persons found was definitely inadequate, grossly inadequate, says Doris Hamilton Willie. The compensation, the money that they were now supposed to receive to pay the stipendary magistrates wasn't a lot. So of course, that was also a challenge. The compensation money was tied to the passing of the Emancipation Act in order to force assemblies to pass the act. No compensation money would be paid if the act was not passed. So the 20,000, well, the $20 million that was supposed to be paid out to the planters would not be paid until the act was passed. Can you imagine? The act says that they should get money, but yet they want to collect the money without actually allowing the act to be passed. The hypocrisy. There was now, in 1835, $30,000 grant for education of ex-slaves was given to the missionaries to eliminate the possibility of planters using the desire for an education to exploit the slaves. Thinking one of the best moves by the British government, but in terms of the amount of money that was allocated, that was rather insufficient. But a very good move here, because had this not been implemented, then we recognize that the planters would have used this to their advantage and offer the ex-slaves jobs, but at very, very, very cheap and low rates. Problems apprentices faced with the implementation of the Emancipation Act. 1. Planters classified artisans as predials, that is, as field slaves, naturally to get more out of them. So instead of them working for 4 years like the domestics, they had to work for 6 years. Could say that was very smart by the whites. The planters justified this classification with the argument that the artisans contributed indirectly to production. 2. Apprentices were sometimes threatened with demotion to the field for offenses like insubordination. So can you imagine that when apprenticeship started out, you started out working as a domestic, classified as a domestic, but because you were insubordinate, you ended up being classified as a field slaves. And we found that the records show that quite a number of slaves, quite a number of the enslaved, now apprentices, were reassigned as field slaves because the planters wanted to get the full 6 years out of their laborers. The planters, in their attempt to keep the apprentices attached to the estates for as long as possible, damaged the planters' in their attempt to keep the apprentices attached to the estates for as long as possible, demanded that they work 8 hours each day for 5 days each week, while the apprentices wanted to work 9 hours each day for 4.5 days each week. So of course they would get 1 whole day for themselves. But because the planters wanted to see them every day working, then they ensure that they map out the day the days so that they wouldn't have any time for themselves to increase their dependence upon them. If planters did not feed the apprentices, the Act said that they would be provided with ground provisions and time to cultivate their grounds. However, where provision grounds were provided, they were usually far away from the estates and the land was infertile, and sometimes the planters charged the apprentices rent for the use of the land. So these were some of the problems that the apprentices faced, the abuses during the system of apprenticeship. They also faced what we would describe as the removal of privileges. So the privileges that many of them had while they were slaves were now removed now that they were apprentices. Some planters refused to give apprentices customary allowances like salt, fish, and rum, and they refused to allow apprentices to graze their animals on the estate land or to use estate tools and equipment as they had done previously, unless they were prepared to work extra hours for their masters. There was no minimum wage act set by emancipation, and planters abused the fact that it was omitted and often paid very little for work done outside of the compulsory 40.5 hours. So this was one of the oversights that the Act would have made, in that they did not affix a minimum wage to the clauses. In some instances, planters freed old and sick slaves in direct contravention of the Act in order to free themselves of the responsibility for providing for them. So for some, emancipation definitely came very, very early because they did not want to continue to feed them. The disabled, the old, persons with disabilities. Free them up. There was no relaxation of harsh estate discipline, and so apprentices were still being flogged. Apprentices were still being flogged, although this was mainly done by the stipendary magistrates, who some apprentices distrusted because they felt that some magistrates sided with the planters. Apprentices found it difficult to reconcile the fact that they were legally free, yet they were being flogged. I mean, legally freed, but yet still you are being flogged. And the stipendary magistrates, who are supposed to be the ones taking care of you, looking out for your best interest, they are the ones who are siding with the planters and also doing the flogging. What a atrocity. We go further. Problems faced by stipendary magistrates. So the magistrates faced more problems than they sought to supervise the apprenticeship system. So many problems they faced. Apprenticeship was neither full slavery nor full freedom. So the magistrates' administration of it was difficult and confusing for all of the parties, because there was a lot of elbow room, you would say, on the side of the planters in terms of what they could do, what they did. And of course, being white, many of the stipendary magistrates just had to work with them white counterparts. The system was grossly underfinanced, and so the magistrates were underpaid. And if you're driving on the road and you are stopped and they say right or left, you know which way to choose. So you have to grease the palm, you know? So in many instances, bribes were accepted by the stipendary magistrates because, of course, they were underpaid. They were old. They were retired soldiers. So many of them left their family in England, and the remittances that they had to send to England wasn't sufficient. So they took bribes, many of them. There was no provision for sick leave. So you can imagine, as a stipendiary magistrate, you're moving around and you're sick. No provision for sick leave. Or return passage to England if they were dismissed from service, or if they were forced to return home because of ill health. So the system wasn't treating them properly at all. No provisions were made for when they traveled to plantation holdings. They had to depend on the planters to put them up for the night. And of course, naturally, they're going to look out for the persons who look out for them. So in many cases, we found that the apprentices got the bitter end of the stick. So you can imagine, in terms of being isolated, a stipendiary magistrate who visited Appleton Estate in St. Elizabeth. What is the nearest or the closest sugar estate from Appleton? All the way in Westmoreland, right? And then from Westmoreland all the way to St. James. Yeah? So you can imagine going via horseback right across the length and breadth of Jamaica. And there was only, I think, 2 stipendary magistrates that were supposed to supervise the island of Jamaica. And we have over 7 to 10 plantations that they had to visit. That was very, very difficult. Local legislatures and governors often obstructed the magistrates from carrying out their duties. So they were faced with problems on the local front from the very persons who should have been helping them to carry out their functions. So naturally, apprenticeship system failed. Coincidentally though, not all British West Indian colonies implemented apprenticeship. In Antigua, there was no need for an apprenticeship system. So, on August 1, 1834, Antigua granted all the slaves their freedom. Why was this so? The island was small, densely populated, and there was no fear of a labor shortage, since, of course, the people, the ex-slaves, would be fully responsible for themselves and their family. They would have to work in order to survive. So based on the small nature of Antigua and the fact that most, if not all, of the island was fully owned and established, so there was no idle land there that they could go and use or settle or buy. And then they figured that they would have to work to feed their families. And the only work that is going to be provided is on the sugar estates. So there was no need for it. The planters calculated that it would be cheaper to hire and pay only the number of people required to work on the estate at any given time. So they were figuring out that, hey, but wait, based on the number of apprentices that we are going to have to care for, it would be cheaper if we simply just take abolition, take emancipation, give them their freedom, and then simply we just hire the ones that we need. So the idea of where would the where would the ex-slaves live in Antigua once this abolition was given was that they would have to remain on the plantations, because squatting, even though it was possible, because it was illegal and because the territory was so small, it was less than likely that a slave who left the plantation to go and squat would not be caught. The island is that small, right? So those were the reasons why Antigua adopted, instead of going with apprenticeship, they simply just decided to go with full on emancipation. All right. So we are coming down. So the reasons now for apprenticeship ending in 1838. One, they felt that slavery was uneconomical and that they would benefit far more from free labor than from using the apprentices. So they kind of start to catch on late on what Antigua was doing, because in the rest of the British Caribbean, they would have to be feeding everybody. In Antigua, they would simply just have to provide funding for those persons who actually did work. Two, the domestic apprentices were freed in 1838, and the planters felt that it would be impractical to retain one set of apprentices and free the other, while they were both needed for the effective operation of the estate. Those who were retained could create trouble for the planters for failing to give them their freedom. And of course, we know that the field slaves would have been the ones who were the fiercest of the bundle out of all three sets. So the domestics, the artisans, and the field slaves. So the field slaves would have been the fiercest of all. So they figured that, hey, then if we give the domestics their freedom and they go on about their business, and we don't give the field slaves their freedom, it's quite possible that they're going to revolt. Then they'll have more revolt on their hand. So they decided that it would be best to give them their freedom. The apprentices who were anticipating their complete freedom were becoming resistive. So they definitely wanted their freedom. and they were counting down on the clock. So instead of withholding it from them, they simply just say, hey, let us give it to them, give them what they want. The anti-slavery society was also now starting its campaigning, as the humanitarians were convinced that the ex-slaves had not yet tasted the sweets of freedom, and that it was time that they should. The result was that the decision was taken to bring the apprenticeship system to an end on August 1, 1838. August 1, 1838 marks a historic date in the history of the Caribbean, because it was on that date that all slaves in the British Caribbean were given their liberation. They were given their freedom by the British government. All right, let me hear, what are your observations? What are your thoughts? Observations, thoughts, anybody?